Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. We are diving headfirst today into some pretty significant trade developments.
Definitely significant.
Big news dropped just yesterday, April 2nd, the announcement of these 2025 U.S. tariffs. And, well, we're all about looking beyond the immediate economic ripples here at the deep dive.
Absolutely.
So our focus today is really going to be on what these tariffs could mean for global climate action. You know, international trade and environmental progress, they're kind of like two sides of the same coin, right?
Yeah, very much so. Intertwined, for sure.
And these tariffs, well, they have the potential to really shake things up, for better or for worse.
A lot of moving pieces to consider.
For sure. So we've been digging into the early analyses, the projections, all that good stuff, trying to get a handle on whether these tariffs might actually help us move towards a more sustainable future, or whether they might, throw a wrench in the works.
A lot of different perspectives out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are also really interested in how different regions around the world might react to these tariffs. What kind of strategies might we see from governments, businesses, even individual consumers? That's what we're here to unpack today.
Should be a fascinating conversation.
Absolutely. So first things first, let's talk about the potential for some pretty significant shifts in green industries, particularly across Europe and Asia. What are you seeing in the early analysis there?
Well, one of the most immediate impacts we're likely to see is a bit of a redrawing of that global manufacturing map.
Okay, makes sense.
I mean, with tariffs hitting key manufacturing nations like China, 34%, Vietnam, 46%, India, 26%, businesses are inevitably going to be looking at those numbers and thinking, okay, where should we be making our products?
Right. And I imagine that raises some really important questions about, whether we could see a move towards production in countries that maybe have less stringent environmental regulations.
Yeah.
Places like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Laos, those come to mind.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If businesses prioritize dodging those tariffs above all else, even over things like energy efficiency and environmentally sound practices, that could definitely be a slippery slope.
Right. We could end up with a situation where even if the overall quantity of goods being produced stays roughly the same, the carbon intensity of making those goods actually goes up because production is shifted to these regions with weaker environmental oversight.
Precisely. And then there's another layer to consider, the logistics. I mean, think about the emissions generated just from transporting those goods all over the world.
Right. If production moves further away from the major consumer markets, like let's say to Africa or Latin America, wouldn't that automatically lead to an increase in shipping emissions just from those longer journeys?
Exactly. Every extra nautical mile means more fuel burned, more greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere. It really highlights how interconnected these issues are. Trade policy, climate impacts are all intertwined.
So a seemingly simple change in where a product is made can actually have a ripple effect across the whole system just based on the transportation involved.
It's a chain reaction for sure.
It's not all doom and gloom though, right? I mean, there are some potential upsides to all this shuffling around. What about the countries facing lower tariffs? Mexico, Canada, the UK, Australia, all at 10%. Could we see a surge in greener manufacturing in those places?
Well, there's definitely a strong possibility for what we call nearshoring, right? Where businesses start to prioritize those regional supply chains, bringing production closer to their end markets. Countries with those lower tariff barriers could become pretty attractive hubs for that.
So instead of relying on those really long, sprawling global supply lines, we might actually see a resurgence in more localized production. And if we're talking about countries like the EU, the UK, Australia, which often have more robust environmental standards than some of the current manufacturing powerhouses, wouldn't that actually be a net positive for the environment?
It could be. That's the optimistic scenario, of course. If those investments flow towards countries with stricter environmental regulations, and this is crucial, if those regulations are actually enforced, then yes, we could potentially see a shift towards more sustainable production practices, at least for some types of goods.
Let's zoom in on the European Union for a second. They're looking at a 20% tariff. Given their pretty strong commitment to climate action, how do you see them responding?
Well, I think it's safe to say that the EU is very likely to double down on their existing green industrial policies. We could see a strengthening of their carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, that aims to level the playing field when it comes to carbon costs between EU producers and importers.
Okay, so basically making sure that everyone's playing by the same rules, regardless of where they're producing their goods.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we could also see the EU pushing even harder for greater self-sufficiency in those critical clean technologies, reducing their reliance on imports, essentially.
Makes sense. Now, India has been making a big push to position itself as a major manufacturing alternative to China, and they're facing a 26% tariff. Could this actually give them a boost, particularly in the low-carbon sector?
This could be a real opportunity for India, no doubt. If they can effectively attract companies that are looking to diversify their supply chains away from China, not just by offering competitive costs, but also by demonstrating a real commitment to low-carbon manufacturing, I think they could become a major player in the green industrial space.
And a big part of that would be, powering those factories with renewable energy, right? Really walking the walk when it comes to sustainability.
Exactly. Actions speak louder than words, especially in this arena.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the ASEAN nations, a region with a lot of potential, but also facing some pretty hefty tariffs. Vietnam and Indonesia, 46% and 32% respectively. How do you see those tariffs playing out, particularly for the growing solar and battery manufacturing industries in the region?
For ASEAN, these tariffs could represent a real turning point. Those higher costs for exporting to the U.S. market might actually incentivize them to strengthen their domestic and regional supply chains, particularly for key green technologies like solar panels and batteries. We can see more investment flowing into ASEAN countries to meet their own growing demand for clean energy and potentially even to serve other global markets that aren't as impacted by these specific U.S. tariffs.
So a bit of a forced inward turn, but one that could ultimately accelerate their own energy transition.
In a way, yes, it could push them towards greater self-reliance in the clean energy sector.
Fascinating. So we've talked about Europe, Asia, all these potential shifts in the global industrial landscape. But let's turn our attention now to a real powerhouse in the clean tech world, China. How do you see these tariffs impacting their established dominance?
Well, even with a 34% tariff in place, I think it would be a mistake to underestimate China's ability to adapt and remain a major force in the clean tech arena.
Right. I mean, we're talking about essential components here. Solar panels, EV batteries, all sorts of green tech, building blocks. And China's control over those supply chains is extensive. It's not something you can just disentangle overnight.
Absolutely. Disruptions at this scale are going to have ripple effects, and it's going to take time for alternative sources to emerge that can match China's production capacity, their cost effectiveness, their speed. So while these tariffs will undoubtedly raise costs for U.S. renewable energy projects that rely on those Chinese components and potentially slow down the pace of decarbonization in the U.S., it's too early to declare the end of China's clean tech dominance.
Okay, so it's more of a speed bump than a roadblock at this point.
I think that's a fair assessment.
But China's not just going to sit back and take it, right? I mean, what about the possibility of them doubling down on their own decarbonization efforts, making their export industries even cleaner, and potentially offering even more competitively priced green tech products to offset those tariffs?
That's a very real possibility. China has the industrial might and the strategic vision to pull that off. By investing even more heavily in renewable energy to power their manufacturing sector, they could potentially absorb some of those tariff costs and maintain their competitive edge through sheer scale. Plus, products made with cleaner energy are inherently more attractive to buyers who are prioritizing sustainability.
Right, the embedded carbon footprint of those products becomes a selling point.
Exactly.
And what about other global markets? China's been actively expanding its reach, particularly in the global south, and through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. Could they simply pivot their focus for green tech exports towards those regions?
Absolutely. Diversifying their export markets has always been a key strategy for China. And the Global South represents a huge and rapidly growing market for affordable clean energy technologies. The Belt and Road Initiative provides existing infrastructure and trade networks that China can leverage to channel those exports. So yeah, a shift in focus towards those regions could really help them mitigate the impact of U.S. tariffs.
And let's not forget about China's dominance in the mining and processing of critical minerals, those essential ingredients for all sorts of clean technologies. Lithium, rare earth elements, those come to mind. How could they leverage that control in this new tariff environment?
Well, that control over the upstream supply of those critical minerals gives China a significant amount of leverage, even if their finished green tech products are facing tariffs. Their dominance in the raw materials market means they can influence costs and availability, which could make it more difficult and expensive for other countries to develop their own independent, competitive green tech industries.
So even with those tariffs, it seems like China remains a central player in this whole game with multiple strategies at their disposal to adapt and maintain their influence.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about a smaller but potentially very strategic player, Singapore. They're facing a 10% tariff, but it seems like they have some pretty big ambitions in the green finance and carbon market space.
Yeah, Singapore's an interesting case. They're really positioning themselves as a hub for green finance and the logistics that underpin Asia's energy transition. And that 10% tariff doesn't seem to be slowing them down much.
So what makes Singapore so well suited to become a green trade finance hub?
They've got a really strong foundation with their well-established financial infrastructure and their proactive approach to sustainability. They're also rolling out initiatives focused on climate trade financing, which can offer more favorable terms for businesses that are engaged in environmentally sustainable trade activities. And then there's the use of green letters of credit, which essentially help verify the environmental credentials of transactions.
So making it easier for businesses to access green capital and demonstrate their commitment to sustainability.
Exactly.
And of course, logistics are absolutely crucial for global trade. Singapore has one of the busiest ports in the world. How do they plan to transform that into a carbon-neutral logistics hub? It's a multi-pronged approach. They're looking at electrifying their port equipment, attracting shipping companies that prioritize lower emissions, offering incentives for vessels using cleaner fuels, implementing shore power facilities to reduce emissions from docked ships. They've got a long-term vision, and they're taking concrete steps to get there.
Okay, so they're really trying to walk the walk on that one.
Yeah, for sure.
Now let's talk about Climate Impact X, or CIX as it's known. There's been a lot of buzz about its potential to become a major global player in the carbon credit market. Some are even suggesting it could offer a more competitive alternative to the established Western markets. What are your thoughts on that? I think CIX has a few things going for it. First, they have access to a potentially larger and more competitively priced pool of carbon credits from projects within ASEAN nations. Second, they're embracing blockchain technology, which could streamline transactions and make them more transparent compared to some of the traditional carbon credit trading platforms. And third, they're really well positioned to tap into the rising demand for carbon offsets that's likely to emerge as companies grapple with the implications of these tariffs on their supply chains.
So more affordable credits, faster transactions through blockchain, and a direct link to that tariff-related demand. Sounds like a pretty compelling value proposition.
Right. And then there's the fact that CIX might be more flexible in terms of the types of carbon credits it recognizes. They might be more open to accepting credits from nature-based solutions, which have sometimes faced tougher standards in Western markets.
That could open up a whole new avenue for carbon offsetting projects. Now, could Singapore strategically leverage all of this, the green finance focus, the carbon market development, to attract green technology companies that might be looking to relocate because of the trade tensions between China and the U.S.?
Absolutely. They've got a stable business environment, they're offering financial incentives, and there's talk of potentially creating a dedicated climate tech special economic zone. All of that could make Singapore a really attractive destination for green tech companies looking for a safe haven amidst all the global trade uncertainty.
So they're really positioning themselves as a key player in the Asian green economy, even with these global trade shifts happening all around them.
They're definitely playing the long game here.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from the macro shifts in global trade to the specific strategies of different regions. But let's bring it down to the individual level now. What are some practical things that consumers, particularly in the US, can do to navigate potential price increases as a result of these tariffs while still supporting climate action?
Well, one key thing is to become a more conscious consumer. Prioritize those durable, repairable goods. If tariffs are driving up prices, extending the lifespan of the products you already own becomes even more important, both economically and environmentally.
Right, make it last.
Exactly. And when you are buying new things, try to seek out products that are made in the USA or that come from allied nations, particularly in the clean tech sector. Those products might be less affected by the new tariffs.
Good point. What about taking advantage of those existing incentives designed to promote green energy adoption?
Absolutely. Those tax credits and rebates available through the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, can really help offset any price increases on imported components. So if you're thinking about getting solar panels, a heat pump, now might be the time to do it.
And what about for folks who are in the market for a new car? Any advice there?
Well, if you've been thinking about making the switch to an electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid, now might be a good time to do it before those potential tariff-driven price increases really kick in.
So get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. Beyond those purchasing decisions, what other actions can individuals take to make a difference?
Well, get involved. Let your elected officials know that you support policies that promote clean energy jobs and a sustainable economy. Consider your investments. Maybe explore divesting from companies that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels and look into green ETFs or mutual funds that support domestic renewable energy initiatives.
And are there smaller, everyday things that people can do?
Absolutely. Reducing food waste and energy consumption at home is always a good idea, both for your wallet and the environment. And as import costs potentially rise, those efforts can really help you stretch your budget.
Okay, so every little bit helps.
Every little bit counts, for sure. And a lot of these same principles apply to a global audience, too. Buying locally, choosing durable products, reducing waste, even shifting towards more plant-based diets, all of these things can make a positive difference.
And when it comes to energy and transportation choices on a broader scale?
Transitioning to renewable energy sources for your home, if that's an option for you, and prioritizing public transport, cycling, electric vehicles, all of those things are important. And globally, investing in local and green markets and being prepared for potential price increases on imported goods are important considerations.
Okay, so being mindful of where your money is going and making choices that align with your values.
Exactly. And finally, don't underestimate the power of collective action. Advocate for climate-friendly trade policies. Explore joining or forming cooperative buying groups to access local sustainable goods at better prices.
So it's about informed consumer choices, leveraging those green incentives, supporting policies that align with your values, and really just adopting more sustainable habits in your daily life.
It's about being proactive, being informed, and making your voice heard.
Wow, this has been a truly insightful deep dive into the potential impact of these 2025 U.S. tariffs on climate action. It's clear that the situation is incredibly complex with both challenges and opportunities on the horizon.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic situation with a lot of moving pieces.
And ultimately, those long-term environmental outcomes are going to depend on the choices that governments, businesses, and individuals make in the coming years.
That's the key takeaway, I think. It's a shared responsibility.
So, as we wrap up today, here's a final thought to leave you with. How can this disruption of those long-established global trade patterns, while potentially creating some short-term bumps in the road, actually serve as a catalyst to accelerate the transition towards a more sustainable and resilient future for everyone? Something to ponder as we all navigate these uncharted waters.
A lot to think about.
This deep dive into the impact of the 2025 U.S. tariffs on climate action was brought to you by profitable Earth consulting services helping businesses thrive in the green trade era.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time.